The US and several European embassies in Kyiv have temporarily closed amid warnings of significant air attack threats.
EU leaders arrived for the second and final day of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro.
A truce between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon is within grasp, according to a US envoy negotiating between both sides of the war. A representative from the Biden administration said the militant group responded positively to a proposal that both its fighters and Israeli ground forces withdraw from a UN buffer zone in southern Lebanon. In such a scenario, the buffer zone would be policed by thousands of additional UN peacekeepers and Lebanese troops. However, despite the US envoy's positivity, the technical details of any potential truce are still unsolved. Israel is likely to call for more enforcement along the buffer zone between the two countries, including the ability to conduct military operations against threats from Hezbollah. Lebanon is likely to oppose those operations along the buffer zone, where UN peacekeepers were reportedly attacked after tensions escalated.
The US Embassy in Kyiv has closed temporarily following warnings of a potential air attack threat. In the statement published online, US citizens in Kyiv were also told to be prepared to take shelter. Several European embassies have also followed the US lead by closing their locations in Kyiv as well. The warning comes in a moment of increased tension as Ukraine used US-supplied long-range missiles to strike Russian territory for the first time on Tuesday. Putin's press secretary said that Washington was adding fuel to the fire by authorizing the weapons. President Biden has significantly stepped up US aid to Ukraine since Donald Trump won the presidential election. In the White House's most recent move, Biden has agreed to give Ukraine anti-personnel mines to use on their own territory. Much of the international community has long banned the use of these mines due to the significant injury they have caused to humans, including civilians. Ukraine has pledged to only use mines that remain active for a limited period of time and not to use them in areas populated with civilians.
1,000 days into Ukraine war, the rage of Ukrainian people towards Russians is growing. Many believe that they are not doing enough to stop the war. Russian opposition activists Yulia Navalnaya, Ilya Yashin and Vladimir Kara-Murza therefore organized a march against the war in Berlin. The participants came with mixed feelings.
Русские и путинские – это не одно и то же, потому что пропаганда российская, кремлевская пропаганда, скажем так, пытается сделать все, чтобы отождествить весь народ с, собственно, вот этой террористической организацией, которая захватила власть в стране.
Many Ukrainians say it is wrong to blame Putin alone. They see a collective responsibility for the war on the part of the Russian population.
Их все равно больше. Если они доказывают о том, что типа это не коллективная вина, то где же тогда не коллективная? Сколько их миллион, сколько их людей, да? То есть как бы они не вышли, они в любом случае бы режим, они бы свалили бы режим, но они ничего не сделали.
Meanwhile, a group of Ukrainians has gathered in front of the Russian embassy. They criticized the lack of accountability within the Russian community.
2 years living in Germany, this is the first time I see Russians doing a march against Putin's war, although that is their war.
Russian activist Vladimir Kara-Murza, who spent 2.5 years in a Russian prison for opposing the war in Ukraine, says he is proud of the resistance movement in Russia.
I'm proud of the fact that so many of our fellow Russian citizens have publicly spoken out against Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine since February 2022, many at the cost of their personal freedom. We have a record number of political prisoners today, more political prisoners in Russia today than in the whole of the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. And the fastest growing category in the Russian political prisoner list are those Russian citizens who have publicly spoken out against Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine. And this fact makes me proud.
И Россия будет свободна! Россия
Der Antikriegsmarsch war der erste gemeinsame Schritt der russischen Gemeinschaft in Richtung eines aktiven Protests gegen den Krieg in der Ukraine. Doch viele Ukrainerinnen und Ukrainer sind sich einig, dass es dabei nicht bleiben darf. Es muss noch mehr passieren. Diana Resnick aus Berlin für Euronews.
EU leaders arrived for the second and final day of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, during which the ongoing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, as well as uncertainty over US politics, were high on the agenda. Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva opened Tuesday's session by calling for more action to slow global warming, saying developed nations should consider moving their 2050 emission goals forward to 2040 or 2045. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron met with Chinese President Xi Jinping for a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the summit. He reaffirmed France's commitment to strengthening relations with China and insisted that the two countries shared the same views on promoting peace in Ukraine.
Nous avons véritablement une communauté là aussi de vues pour faire respecter la Charte des Nations Unies et promouvoir un agenda de paix. Nous nous retrouvons au millième jour de la guerre d'agression lancée par la Russie contre l'Ukraine et je sais que vous partagez, comme nous, la volonté d'une paix durable, respectueuse de la Charte des Nations Unies, et que vous partagez comme nous la même inquiétude après les déclarations belliqueuses et escalatoires de la Russie en matière de doctrine nucléaire.
It comes after the French president hosted the Chinese leader on his state visit to Paris earlier this year.
French farmers protested for a third day on Wednesday after setting up a blockade on the highway near the French-Spanish border. Their aim is to block heavy goods vehicle traffic from Spain to France, protesting against an EU-Mercosur trade deal with South American nations. The French Minister for Agriculture condemned the blockade, saying it risked undermining public empathy for the profession.
Protester contre le Mercosur, exprimer ses inquiétudes, revendiquer un certain nombre d'avancées dans différents domaines, c'est légitime. S'en prendre aux biens, s'en prendre aux personnes, bloquer durablement le pays, ça n'est pas acceptable.
The farmers say producers from countries that are part of the Mercosur agreement are not subject to regulations as strict as those in Europe. They also say it creates unfair competition with third countries.
Thousands of UK farmers have descended on Parliament to protest the Labour government's decision to increase inheritance tax. The hike was announced in last month's budget and would see the end to a tax break dating from the 1990s that exempts agricultural property from the levy. It means that from April 2026, farms worth more than £1 million will face a 20% tax when the owner dies and they are passed on to the next generation. Farmers say such an increase in tax will deal a hammer blow to family farms, which are already struggling from the impact of climate change, global instability and the upheaval caused by Brexit.
If the government ends farming, which is seemingly what it wants to do, where do we get our food from?
But the UK centre-left government says the vast majority of farms will not be affected, and various loopholes mean a farming couple can pass on an estate worth up to £3 million tax-free.
A travelling exhibition exploring the history of fake news and forgery has opened in Budapest. The interactive collection, put together by the House of European History, reveals that the concept of fake news has existed for centuries, from the forging of sacred relics to the invention of conspiracy theories.
We start the exhibition with a practice of antiquity, which was called the condemnation of memory. It was a practice by which they tried to erase people from history. And the exhibition ends in this location in Budapest with an additional case study added by our host, the Open Society Archives, which looked at the case of Imre Nagy and how his name was purged from history until 1989.
The interactive nature of the exhibition allows visitors to become fact-checkers themselves, with screens which allow them to decide which news to censor or publish. The collection also explores cases in history where forgery was used for good. During the Holocaust, for example, thousands of lives were saved by fake identity cards and passports. The exhibition is open until the 16th of February. 30 years and 22 Grand Slams later, the moment has finally arrived for tennis legend Rafa Nadal to leave the court. After being knocked out of the Davis Cup on Tuesday, the Spaniard said a special goodbye to fans in Málaga.
Han sido 20 años de carrera profesional en los que me habéis llevado en volandas siempre, ¿no? En los momentos buenos me ayudabais a ganar el siguiente punto y en los momentos malos, sin ninguna duda, pues me empujabais a seguir peleando.
Hola, mi amigo. Tennis opponents and friends from around the world prepared a video for the tennis star, thanking him for everything and wishing him the best of luck in his retirement.
President-elect Donald Trump joined Elon Musk to watch the launch of another SpaceX Starship rocket from South Texas. It's the 6th test flight of the rocket, which is the world's biggest and most powerful spacecraft. Unlike last month's successful test, however, the rocket's booster was directed to land in the Gulf of Mexico rather than on the launch site. SpaceX and NASA hope that Starship will one day be used to get astronauts back on the moon and eventually on Mars.